The sun was still struggling to make its way between the skyscrapers when Jason opened his eyes. Union Square was already coming to life, with the first workers hurriedly crossing toward the subway stations. Beside him, Max stretched his paws, yawning with that tranquility that only dogs can maintain even in the most adverse situations. "Good morning, buddy," Jason murmured, stroking the golden fur of the Labrador. "Another day, huh?" Max wagged his tail and licked the boy's face, as he had done every morning for almost 2 years. Since they found each other, or rather since Max found him, the two had created a routine that kept them united against the uncertainties of life on the streets. Jason got up, stretching his arms to awaken his body still numbed by irregular sleep. At 10 years old, he already carried on his shoulders a responsibility that many adults didn't know. It wasn't just about surviving, but surviving together with Max, protecting him, feeding him, making sure they were both always safe. "Come on, boy. Today's going to be a good day, I can feel it," he said, tying the laces of his worn-out sneakers that he had received from a kind lady the previous week. As they walked through the square, Jason discreetly observed a man in a suit who always appeared at the same time, always in the same place. The guy had a serious, almost melancholic expression, and his eyes seemed to be looking for something specific. Jason had learned to read people like reading the weather, a necessary skill for someone living on the streets. "That guy is here again, Max," he whispered to the dog. "Is he really watching us, or is it just my imagination?" Max just wagged his tail, more interested in the smell of sweet bread coming from the nearby bakery. Jason smiled. His companion's simplicity always calmed him. On the other side of the city, Richard Wilson finished reviewing the morning financial reports in his office on the top floor of a luxury commercial building. At 35, he had inherited not only the family fortune, but also the arrogance that came with it. For Richard, the world was divided between those who mattered and those who simply existed, occupying space. "Mr. Wilson," the secretary entered, the room with a stack of documents. "The morning meetings have been rescheduled. You have the afternoon free." Richard nodded without raising his eyes from the papers. "Perfect. I'll take a ride around the city on my motorcycle. I need to clear my mind before tomorrow's meetings." 20 minutes later, the powerful roar of his sports bike echoed through the streets of New York City. Richard felt powerful at the handlebars, as if the entire city were his personal track. Traffic rules were merely suggestions for someone with his connections and influence. At that same moment, Jason and Max were walking peacefully along the sidewalks near the square. The boy was counting coins he had collected during the morning, calculating if it would be enough to buy food for both of them. $23, Max. Enough to buy that small bag of dog food and still have some left for a sandwich for me," he said, smiling with satisfaction. "Not so bad after all." That's when the deafening sound of Richard's motorcycle tore through the morning air. Jason instinctively pulled Max closer, realizing that the driver had no intention of slowing down. For a brief second, the boy's eyes met those of the businessman through the helmet visor. Richard saw just another obstacle in his way. Jason saw something that made him shudder, a coldness he knew well, the same he saw in the eyes of people who treated him as if he were invisible. But this time it was different. It was as if that man saw him, but deliberately chose to ignore his existence. The motorcycle zoomed past, raising dust and leaving a trail of smoke in the air. Max barked once, more from surprise than anger. Jason stroked the dog's neck, trying to calm him. "It's okay, buddy. People like that exist out there. We just need to be careful." But fate had other plans. Minutes later, Richard decided to take a spin around the square itself, in a maneuver he considered fun but which was clearly an invasion of the space meant for pedestrians. The engine noise echoed between the buildings like thunder on a clear day. As Jason and Max were exactly in the path that Richard had chosen for his fun. The boy noticed the approach and tried to move away, but Max instinctively positioned himself between Jason and the motorcycle, assuming a protective stance that was engraved in his DNA as a loyal dog. What happened next would change the lives of everyone involved forever. If this story interested you, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. We continue. Time seemed to drag when Richard came across Max in his path. The Golden Labrador maintained his protective position, eyes fixed on the motorcycle approaching at dangerous speed. There was no fear in the animal's gaze, only an instinctive determination to protect his boy. Richard could have swerved, he could have slowed down, he could have done anything that demonstrated a minimum of humanity. Instead, he chose the path that would define who he really was at that moment. Without hesitation, he raised his leg and delivered a violent kick to Max. The impact was so brutal that the dog was thrown several yards, whimpering in pain. Jason, trying to protect his companion, lost his balance and fell to the ground, hurting his knee against the rough concrete. For a moment that seemed eternal, the entire square fell silent. The roar of the motorcycle gave way to a heavy silence, interrupted only by Max's low whimpers and Jason's panting breath. Some people stopped to watch, but most continued their routine, accustomed to pretending not to see the suffering of others. Richard didn't even look back. For him, it had been just a minor inconvenience in his morning. He accelerated again and disappeared into traffic, leaving behind a scene that would never leave the memory of those who witnessed it. Jason crawled to Max, tears blurring his vision. The dog was breathing with difficulty, but his eyes remained alert, more concerned about the boy's condition than his own pain. "Max, my friend, are you okay? Talk to me, please," whispered Jason, gently stroking the dog's head. "I shouldn't have let this happen. I should have protected you better." Max made a Herculean effort to lick Jason's hand, as if to console him. That simple gesture broke the boy's heart into even smaller pieces. What neither of them knew was that Kayla, a 22-year-old known on social media for documenting spontaneous moments of urban life, had recorded the whole scene. She was doing a live broadcast about the morning routine in Union Square when she witnessed the act of cruelty. "Guys, you won't believe what I just saw," Kayla said to her phone, camera still in shock. "A guy on a motorcycle just kicked a dog that was protecting a child. This is inhuman." The video started with few viewers, but within minutes it was being shared by hundreds of people. Indignation grew exponentially with each new viewing. Comments of outrage began to flood social media, and soon the top trending hashtags were related to the incident. Meanwhile, Jason managed to help Max stand up. The dog was hurt but could walk, albeit with difficulty. An old man who worked at a nearby newspaper stand approached with a bowl of fresh water. "Son, I saw what happened. What cowardice," said the man with tears in his eyes. "I brought water for your friend. And here's a sandwich that was left over from my breakfast." "Thank you, Mr. Joe," mumbled Jason, recognizing the newsstand owner's genuine kindness. "You've always been kind to us. You two don't deserve to go through this." "Nobody does," replied Mr. Joe, shaking his head sadly. While Jason was taking care of Max on the other side of the city, Richard arrived at his office already completely forgetting the incident. He had important meetings in the afternoon, and his mind was focused on the businesses that moved millions of dollars daily. That's when his secretary entered the room with a worried expression. "Mr. Wilson, there's something here you need to—" "See," she said, extending the tablet with the video that had already been viewed more than 50,000 times in 2 hours. Richard watched the recording with an expression of disbelief. It wasn't possible that this insignificant incident had gained so much repercussion. He barely even remembered what had happened. "This will pass," he said to himself, with the arrogance of someone who had always managed to cover up any problem, with money and influence. "It's just a silly video. Tomorrow no one will even remember it." But Richard was deeply mistaken. The video continued to spread like wildfire, and along with it grew a wave of indignation that would soon transform into something much greater than he could control. In less than 6 hours, the video had surpassed 200,000 views. Kayla stared at her phone in disbelief, watching the numbers rise vertiginously with each screen refresh. She had never imagined that a moment captured by chance could generate such repercussion. "Everyone, I'm trying to locate the boy and the dog from the video," she said in a new live broadcast. I want to know how they're doing and if we can help them somehow. If you have any information, please contact me. Messages arrived by the thousands. Money donations, offers of dog food for Max, clothes for Jason, and even adoption proposals for Max. Solidarity sprouted genuinely, but along with it came dissonant voices as well. Anonymous profiles began to spread a different narrative. This boy uses the dog to deceive people and get money, wrote a fake account. It's all staged to manipulate gullible people who fall for this story. The lie propagated with the same speed as the truth. Within hours, lies in Union Square competed in relevance with the justice for Max. The internet had divided between those seeking to help and those doubting the authenticity of others' suffering. Jason remained in the square, oblivious to this digital storm. His sole concern was with Max, who had been showing signs of trauma since the incident. The dog trembled whenever he heard the sound of any engine, shrinking against the boy's body seeking protection. "Hey, easy, buddy," Jason murmured, stroking Max's ears. "That bad man is gone now. I won't let anyone hurt you again, you hear?" But the words, however loving they might be, couldn't erase the memory of the brutal kick. Max had lost not only confidence, but also his appetite. Even with the bowl of dog food that Mr. Joe had brought, the Labrador merely sniffed the food without showing interest. Meanwhile, in Richard's air-conditioned office, the situation was beginning to spiral out of control. His press advisor had been called in urgently, and the first signs of boycott were already appearing. 3 major companies had cancelled rental contracts in the Wilson family's shopping malls, citing incompatibility of values. "Richard, you see, need to understand the gravity of the situation," said Sarah, his advisor, with a tense voice. "It's not just a viral video. You've become a symbol of everything people hate about the American elite. Arrogance, lack of empathy, contempt for the most vulnerable." Richard rolled his eyes, irritated with the whole situation. "Sarah, it's a street kid and a mutt. In 48 hours this will be forgotten. You know the internet. People have the memory of a goldfish." "Not this time," she replied, showing new data on the tablet. "The video has already been shared by celebrities, politicians, digital influencers. It's become a social movement. And now they're investigating your life, Richard. They've already discovered the traffic tickets you got cancelled, the irregular construction of the last mall, about—" "Enough!" Richard slammed his fist on the desk. "I will not submit to the judgment of a mob of idle people on social media. I have lawyers, I have influence, I have money. This will be resolved the traditional way." But as the afternoon progressed, it became clear that this time would be different. Richard's first nightmare began that very night. He dreamed of a child crying in a dark place, a dog trying to protect him, and himself watching the scene without being able to move or help. He woke up in a cold sweat, with a strange sensation that he had lived that before. On the other side of the city, Jason also couldn't sleep. Max refused to leave his side, staying alert even during the hours when he should be resting. The boy realized that something had permanently changed in his companion, and this filled him with a profound sadness. "I'm going to find out who that man was, Max," he whispered in the dark. "And somehow, I'll make him understand what he did to you." Neither of them knew that their lives were about to intertwine in a way they could never have imagined. 3 days had passed since the incident, and Richard's life was crumbling like a house of cards. Social media hadn't forgotten, as he had predicted. On the contrary, the movement had only gained more strength. Protests began to form in front of the Wilson family's shopping malls, with people holding posters with Max's image and calling for a boycott of the company's businesses. Rebecca Wilson, Richard's younger sister, arrived at his office that morning with a somber expression. At 30, she had always been the voice of reason in the family, trying to balance her brother's destructive impulses with diplomacy and common sense. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. "And this time, you're going to listen to me all the way through." Richard barely raised his eyes from the documents he intended to review in a desperate attempt to maintain a normal routine. "If it's about that ridiculous dog story, I already told you my lawyers will handle everything." "They won't handle anything," Rebecca exploded, losing the patience she always demonstrated. You have no idea what you've done, do you? It's not just about the dog, Richard. It's about who you've become. It's about how our family has completely lost the notion of humanity. Our family built an empire, Rebecca. I won't apologize for being successful. Successful? Rebecca laughed bitterly. Richard, do you remember Ethan? The name fell like a bomb in the silence of the office. Richard froze, the document slipping from his hands. Ethan. How long had it been since he heard that name spoken aloud? Don't come at me with these old stories, Rebecca. This has nothing to do with the current situation. It has everything to do with it, she shouted, tears springing to her eyes. Ethan was our brother, Richard. Our older brother, whom you and Dad threw out of the house when he was only 16. Remember? Richard got up abruptly, walking to the window. The privileged view of the city that always calmed him now seemed a mockery of his situation. Ethan made his choices. He preferred to do drugs and hang out with bums rather than follow the family rules. He was just a confused teenager, Rebecca approached, forcing Richard to look her in the eyes. And after you kicked him out, he lived on the streets for years. On the streets, Richard, just like that boy you attacked. Rebecca's words echoed in the silence like gunshots. Richard felt something stir inside his chest, an old pain that he had buried beneath layers of success and arrogance. Where are you going with this, Rebecca? I want you to understand that that boy could have been Ethan, could have been any child that life treated with cruelty, and you, instead of helping, chose to be just another aggressor. That same afternoon, on the other side of the city, Jason was facing his own demons. Max had significantly worsened. The dog refused to eat, constantly trembled, and couldn't sleep. Worse still, a rumor had begun circulating in the square that authorities might take him away, citing mistreatment based on fake news that had spread. Nothing's going to happen to you, Max, Jason whispered, hugging the dog tightly. I'd die before I let anyone take you from me. That's when an unexpected presence approached. An elderly dog with grayish fur and wise eyes walked slowly toward them. Jason recognized him immediately. It was Duke, an animal known by all the square's residents for his gentleness and almost human intelligence. Duke approached Max with impressive delicacy. Without making a sound, he lay down beside the traumatized Labrador and simply stayed there, radiating a calm that Jason couldn't understand but could feel. For the first time in 3 days, Max stopped trembling. The presence of the older dog brought a comfort that not even Jason's affection could offer at that moment. How do you do that, Duke? Murmured Jason, petting both dogs. How do you know exactly what he needs? Meanwhile, Richard faced another night of nightmares. The same scene repeated itself, a child crying, a dog trying to protect him, and himself watching without being able to move. But this time, the child had a face. It was Ethan at 16, on the day he was thrown out of the house. Richard woke up in panic, his heart beating erratically. For the first time in years, he began to question not only his recent actions, but the entire construction of his personality. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. We continue. A week had passed since the incident, and Richard could no longer pretend his life was normal. The boycotts intensified. 3 major retail chains cancelled million-dollar contracts, and for the first time in his adult life, he faced a real financial crisis. But what disturbed him most wasn't the red numbers in the reports, but the nightmares that had become constant and increasingly vivid. On Friday morning, Richard made a decision that surprised even Sarah, his advisor. He drove to Union Square. Wasn't a rational decision. It was an impulse born from a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and an inexplicable need to see again the scene of his disgrace. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked to the square wearing dark sunglasses and a cap to avoid being recognized. The square maintained its usual movement, but Richard saw it with different eyes. For the first time, he truly observed the people. He saw hurried workers, elderly people feeding pigeons, children playing while mothers chatted. And there, near the same spot where everything happened, was Jason. The boy was talking quietly with Max, who was now accompanied by another, older dog. Richard hid behind a tree, observing discreetly. Jason seemed different from what he had imagined. He wasn't just a child abandoned to his own luck. There was a maturity in the boy's gestures, a way of caring for the dog that revealed genuine and deep love. "Look, Max, Duke brought a new friend for you to meet," Jason was saying, pointing to a small mutt approaching timidly. "Little by little you'll start trusting people again, right, buddy?" Richard felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't the scene his mind had constructed. There was no manipulation, no theater to sensitize passers-by. There was only a boy who loved his dog and was doing everything possible to help him overcome a trauma. It was then that Richard noticed the presence of the man in a suit observing Jason from afar, the same one he had noticed on his first visit to the square. There was something familiar in that posture, in that melancholic gaze he couldn't decipher. At that moment, his cell phone rang. It was Rebecca. "Richard, where are you? You need to come to the office right away. There's a proposal." "That could save our company, but you need to be here in an hour." Richard hesitated. For the first time in his professional life, something seemed more important than business. "Rebecca, I'm resolving a personal matter." "Personal matter?" The surprise in his sister's voice was genuine. "Richard, since when do you put personal matters above business?" It was a pertinent question, and Richard had no answer. He hung up the phone and continued observing Jason, who had now managed to get Max to accept some pieces of dog food. Progress was slow, but there was hope in the scene. Meanwhile, from across the square, the man in the suit gathered courage and approached Jason. Richard became even more attentive, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Excuse me, son," said the man with a hesitant voice. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Jason looked at him with the natural distrust of someone who had learned to protect himself on the streets. "Depends on what you want to talk about." "It's about what happened to your dog. I saw everything and, well, I'd like to help you. Both somehow." "Are you a journalist?" asked Jason, suspicious, "because several have already appeared wanting to interview us, and I don't want Max to appear on TV anymore. He's already scared enough." "No, I'm not a journalist," replied the man, and then made a long pause before continuing. "My name is Ethan Wilson." The surname echoed in Richard's mind like thunder. Wilson. It couldn't be coincidence. He moved closer, straining to hear the conversation. "Actually," continued Ethan with a choked voice, "the man who hurt your dog, he's my younger brother." Jason's eyes widened, processing the information. Max raised his head, as if he too sensed the importance of that moment. Richard felt the world spin around him. The man who had been observing Jason for days was Ethan, his brother. The brother he had helped throw out of the house 20 years ago was there, taking care of the same child he had attacked. Destiny had woven a tapestry too complex to be ignored. Jason studied Ethan's face carefully. At 10 years old, he had developed a keen instinct for detecting true and false intentions. There was something about this man that reassured him, a genuine sadness in his eyes, a posture that didn't try to intimidate or impress. "Your brother?" repeated Jason, nervously petting Max. "The man on the motorcycle is your brother?" Ethan nodded, tears in his eyes. "Unfortunately, yes, and I've been coming here all these days trying to gather courage to talk to you. I wanted to apologize on behalf of my family, even knowing that words won't heal the wounds he caused." "Why don't you live with him? Brothers usually live together, don't they?" Ethan's innocent question hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. How to explain to a 10-year-old child the complexity of a family that throws out its own children? "It's a long and complicated story, Jason. When I was about your age, some bad things happened, and I ended up having to leave home. I lived on the streets for many years, just like you." Jason's eyes widened. "You lived on the streets even though you're rich?" "I'm not rich, Jason. My family has money, but I was thrown out of the house when I was a teenager. I spent years sleeping in places like this, looking for food, trying to survive. It was a very difficult time." Max approached Ethan and cautiously sniffed his hand. To everyone's surprise, the Labrador showed no fear or hostility. On the contrary, he seemed to recognize something familiar in that man. Max likes you, observed Jason, impressed. He doesn't usually trust adults easily, especially after what happened. Maybe he feels I understand his pain, said Ethan, gently stroking Max's head. I, too, have been hurt by people who should have protected me. Hidden. Behind the tree, Richard observed the scene with a mixture of shock, guilt, and something he couldn't identify. Seeing Ethan there, talking gently with the same child he had disrespected, made 20 years of justifications crumble. Ethan continued, Jason, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'd like to help you both. Not out of pity, but because I understand what it's like to be alone in the world. How can you help? Asked Jason, still cautious. Well, first I'd like to take Max to a veterinarian. He needs to be examined after what happened. And then, well, maybe I can help you find a safer place to stay. Jason hesitated. The offer was tempting, but life on the streets had taught him that nothing was free. And what do you want in return? The direct question surprised Ethan. I don't want anything in return, Jason. I just want to do something right to make up for what my brother did wrong. Does your brother know you're here? Ethan shook his head. No, he doesn't even know I still exist. Our family erased me from their history a long time ago. It was at that moment that Richard could no longer contain himself. He stepped out from behind the tree and walked toward the two, removing his dark glasses and cap. When Jason recognized him, he instinctively pulled Max close, and the dog began to tremble again. Ethan, said Richard, his voice hoarse with emotion. Ethan turned slowly, and for the first time in 20 years, the two brothers looked each other in the eye. Time seemed to freeze. 2 decades of hurt, regret, and unspoken words hung in the air between them. Richard, Ethan replied, unable to hide his surprise, what are you doing here? I don't know, admitted Richard, looking alternately at Ethan and Jason. I just knew I needed to come. Jason stood up, protectively placing himself between Max and Richard. You're the man who hurt my dog, he said with impressive courage for a child his age. Richard knelt down, putting himself at Jason's height. For the first time, he really looked at the boy, not as an obstacle or an inconvenience, but as a human being who deserved respect. Yes, said Richard, his voice breaking. I am the man who hurt your dog, and I came here to ask for forgiveness. The words came out of his mouth before he could think about them. It wasn't in his plans to apologize. It wasn't something Richard Wilson usually did. But there, in that moment, before the brother he had lost and the child he had hurt, there was no room for pride. The silence that followed Richard's request for forgiveness was laden with tension. Jason looked at the man kneeling before him, processing the situation with the seriousness of someone who had matured too early. Ethan observed his brother with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Max continued trembling, but didn't try to hide. Forgiveness? Repeated Jason, with a hardness in his voice that contrasted with his age. You think one word will fix what you did to Max? Richard felt each word like a knife wound. No, I don't think one word fixes everything. But it's a beginning. It's the first step to try to repair what I destroyed. You destroyed much more than you imagine, Richard, said Ethan, approaching. It wasn't just Max you hurt. It was this boy's trust in the world. It was the sense of security they had. It was the same as what you and Dad did to me, Ethan completed, and Richard felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. Jason looked from one brother to the other, realizing there was a much bigger story happening here. What did you do to Ethan? Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years of guilt. Jason, when I was 25 and Ethan 17, our family threw him out of the house. Why? Because he was different from us, continued Richard, the words coming out with difficulty. Because he questioned the things our family did, because he had compassion for people we considered inferior. Because he was everything I should have been and never was. Ethan shook his head, emotional. Richard, you were young. Dad influenced you, taught you that feelings were weakness. No, Richard stood up abruptly. Don't make excuses for me, Ethan. I was old enough to know the difference between right and wrong. I chose to be cruel. I chose to throw out my own, rather because he showed me what I didn't have the courage to be. Jason watched everything with wide eyes. He had never seen adults confront their own failures like this. And after you threw him out, what happened? I lived on the streets. For 5 years, answered Ethan. I slept in squares like this, went hungry, cold, afraid. I learned that the world can be very cruel to those who have no protection. Like the world is cruel to me and Max, murmured Jason. Exactly, said Ethan. And when I finally managed to get back on my feet, got a job, a small house, a simple life, I swore I would never again let an injustice pass when I could prevent it. Richard looked at Ethan with admiration and shame. That's why you were here all these days. You weren't just observing Jason. You were deciding how to protect him. And that's why you approached him today, completed Richard. Because you saw in him the boy you once were. At that moment, Richard's cell phone rang insistently. It was a call from an unknown number, but he recognized the voice on the other end of the line immediately. Mr. Wilson, this is from the production of the City Debate Show. Would you accept participating in a live interview tomorrow about the Union Square incident? We want to hear your side of the story. Richard looked at Jason and Ethan. An interview? Yes, sir. It will be live at 8 in the evening. The program wants to mediate a dialogue between you and the affected boy. The entire city is following this case. Jason approached Richard. I accept, he said, surprising everyone. I want to talk to you on television. Jason, are you sure? Asked Ethan, concerned. Yes, I am. I have things to say. Things everyone needs to hear. Richard hung up the phone and looked at the boy. Jason, you don't have to do this. I know you hate me and you have every right to. I don't hate you, replied Jason, stroking Max. I feel sorry for you. The words were like a slap to Richard's face. Pity. A 10-year-old child who lived on the streets, who had been attacked by him, felt sorry for him. Why do you feel sorry for me, Jason? Because you're very rich, but you're very poor inside. Because you have family, but you're alone. Because you hurt others to avoid feeling your own pain. Ethan looked at Jason with astonishment. That 10-year-old boy had just made a more accurate psychological analysis than years of therapy could offer. Jason, said Richard with a trembling voice, what are you going to say on television? The boy looked at the two brothers, then at Max, who was now calmer, and finally back at Richard. I'm going to ask a question you'll have to answer in front of everyone. What question? Jason smiled for the first time since Richard had met him. It was a sad smile, but full of wisdom that surpassed his age. You'll find out tomorrow, along with everyone else. The television studio was packed. Cameras strategically positioned captured all angles, and social media was buzzing with real-time comments. The entire city had stopped to watch the confrontation that promised to be historic. Richard arrived at the studio accompanied by his lawyers, but his posture had changed. He was no longer the arrogant businessman who considered himself above consequences. He was a man who had spent the night awake, thinking about every word that Ethan and Jason had said. Jason entered the studio accompanied by Ethan, and at his request, Max was also present. The Labrador still showed signs of trauma, but had improved significantly with the constant presence of Duke, who was waiting outside. Good evening, New York, said the host Amanda Phillips. We're here for a conversation that may change how our city views empathy, respect, and humanity. On my right, businessman Richard Wilson. On my left, Jason Adams and his companion Max. The cameras focused on each of the participants. Richard took a deep breath, trying to control his anxiety. Jason calmly stroked Max, demonstrating impressive serenity. Mr. Wilson, began Amanda, would you like to start by explaining what happened that morning in Union Square? Richard looked at Jason before answering. I was in a hurry, irritated with work issues. When I saw Jason and Max in my way, I reacted in the worst possible way. There's no justification for what I did. And now, how do you feel about what happened? I feel ashamed. I feel guilty, but mainly I feel grateful. The answer surprised everyone. Grateful? Grateful because Jason and Max showed me who I had really become. Grateful because, through them, I reunited with my brother Ethan, whom I had lost 20 years ago because of my arrogance and cruelty. The camera showed Ethan in the audience, wiping tears from his eyes. "Jason," said Amanda, turning to the boy, "you said you had a question to ask Mr. Wilson. We're all curious to know what it is." Jason nodded, looking directly at Richard. The studio fell into absolute silence. Even the technicians stopped moving. "Mr. Wilson," said Jason with a clear and firm voice, "I want to know if you have a heart." The question echoed through the studio like thunder. It was simple, direct, but loaded with a depth that no one expected. "Because," continued Jason, "if you have a heart, then you know that Max also has one. And if you know that Max has a heart, then you know he can feel pain, can feel fear, can feel love. And if you know this, then you know that what you did to him was much more than kicking an animal. You hurt a heart that only knew how to love." Richard felt tears streaming down his face. For the first time in his adult life, he cried. In public, without caring who was watching. "I do have a heart, Jason," he said, his voice breaking. "I have a heart that I had buried under so much pride and selfishness that I forgot it existed. But you and Max reminded me that it still beats. And it's hurting now. Hurting badly for what I did." Jason stood up and walked over to Richard. To everyone's amazement, he extended his small hand to the businessman. "If you promise to use your heart to help other people like me and Max, then I forgive you." Richard took Jason's hand carefully, as if he were holding something very precious. "I promise, Jason, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your forgiveness." Max approached slowly. For the first time since the incident, the dog didn't tremble in Richard's presence. Instead, he sniffed his hand and, to everyone's surprise, licked his fingers. "He forgave you too," said Jason, smiling. "Max has always been smarter than people." The interview continued for a few more minutes, but that moment had been the emotional climax that would change everything. When they left the studio, Richard turned to Ethan. "Brother," he said, using the word he hadn't pronounced in 20 years, "can you forgive me too?" Ethan hugged Richard tightly. "I forgave you a long time ago. I was just waiting for you to forgive yourself." 3 months later, the Open Heart Foundation, created by Richard and managed by Ethan, had already helped more than 200 families in vulnerable situations. Jason and Max were the first assisted, gaining a small but comfortable house where the boy could finally study regularly. Duke, the wise dog who had helped Max overcome his trauma, became the official mascot of the foundation, proving that healing and love come in the most unexpected forms. And every morning when Richard woke up, he remembered Jason's question and touched his chest, feeling his heartbeat. A heart that had learned to love again, thanks to a 10-year-old boy and his golden dog, who taught him that true wealth is not measured in money, but in compassion. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Let us know which